You work too much, you know? Jill's voice drifted from behind as her hands began to massage Elliot's tense shoulders. Seated at the dining table, he was hunched forward with his eyes fixed on the spreadsheet, radiating light from his open laptop, his head filled with figures, closing dates, and responsibilities pressing in every direction. Elliot let out a soft chuckle, settling backward with a tired smile up at her. Just trying to keep the bills paid, babe. Give me a few more minutes, and I'm all yours. You always say that. It was playful, though the underlying shift in her tone didn't quite get past Elliot. Jill's hands slipped down his arms, then she abruptly let go and walked away toward the kitchen. I just want to make sure we're ahead of everything, Elliot said, stretching in his chair, as his knuckles popped, leaning back. A glance at his laptop showed it was 6 p.m., dinner time approaching fast. Jill pulled out a bottle of wine from the fridge and 2 glasses. Don't forget, Mom's coming over for dinner tonight, she said nonchalantly, easing the cork out of the bottle, her back to Elliot while talking. Elliot's eyebrow rose at the mention of her mother, Daphne. Her visits were never welcome, not because of her sharp remarks or judgmental look. He was able to take them. It was just her continuous whispering into Jill's ear, subtly feeding doubts about their marriage that always drained him. Through the years, Elliot had gotten used to surviving those dinners through polite responses and a composure of coolness, though they really took him out. Your mom's coming? He asked, without sinking emotion into the words, yet allowing that feeling of unease to set in his chest. Yeah? Jill poured the wine and turned to him, a sly smile playing on her lips. Oh, and one of my friends might drop by too. Elliot's brow furrowed slightly, but he kept his tone casual. One of your friends? For dinner with your mom? He chuckled lightly, though a strange discomfort began to seep in. Is that really a good idea? Jill handed him a glass of wine and leaned casually against the kitchen counter. Trust me, she said, taking a sip. You'll like my friend. Her smile hung on just a beat too long, and Elliot caught a flicker in her eyes, something he couldn't quite read. She'd been acting strange lately, sometimes distant, other times clingy. He wrote it off to stress. Work had been hard lately for both of them, and Elliot was putting in longer hours to keep everything going smoothly. But the strain was beginning to show. I'm sure I will, Elliot replied, though the unease in his gut only grew. He took another sip of the wine and turned back to his laptop, trying to get focused again. But the concentration was gone. His eyes kept drifting back to Jill, who had settled onto the couch with her phone. Her fingers danced across the screen, and every few minutes the phone buzzed, bringing a small, secretive smile to her face that set Elliot even more on edge. Who are you texting? He asked, trying to sound casual. Oh, just some friends, Jill said, not looking away from the screen. Nothing important. Elliot furrowed his brow, but said nothing. He didn't want to be an overbearing husband. He had always treated Jill with respect, even in things that concerned her independence. But tonight, something was wrong. There was an undercurrent in the air, a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere of their home. After a little while, Elliot completed his work and shut the laptop, heaving a sigh of relief. He stood up and stretched, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness gathered there. After a glance in Jill's direction, he headed for the kitchen to see how dinner was doing. What time is your mom coming? Elliot asked, as he peered into the oven, checking the roast. In about an hour, Jill replied absently. She'd been staring down into her phone. And your friend? Who's coming? Elliot dried his hands with a kitchen towel, attempting to sound disinterested. Jill looked up finally, that sly smile again. Just someone I think you'll find interesting. She didn't elaborate, and before he could ask any more, the doorbell rang. That can't be them already, Elliot grumbled, turning to the clock. It was only 6:30. Jill sprang onto her feet, tucking her phone into her back pocket. I'll get it. It's probably Mom. Her voice was casual, even light, but there was something in her inflection that bothered Elliot. She had been behaving strangely all evening. As Jill headed for the door, Elliot dried his palms on a dish towel. His heart racing, he made his way to the dining room, curiosity overtaking apprehension. Elliot, come meet my friend, Jill called. Her voice dripped with the sweetness that seemed so appealing earlier, but now heightened Elliot's anxiety. He had no more than stepped into the room when he froze. His eyes landed on Daphne, Jill's mother, sitting at the head of the table, a smirk etched across her face, as if it was permanently sketched there. But it was not until he looked further to the man Elliot did not know. sat comfortably beside her as though he belonged, that his blood ran cold. He was tall and muscular, with arrogance oozing from every pore. Wearing a tight-fitting black t-shirt and designer jeans, his hair slicked back gave him that effortlessly cool look that immediately made Elliot feel out of place. If that was bad enough, the man's arm casually hung around Jill's waist as she stood beside him, her hand placed on his shoulder like they were some intimate couple. "Elliot, this is Glenn," Jill said, her voice too chipper. She flashed a bright smile to the man at her side. "He's joining us for dinner tonight." Glenn's smile was confident as he extended his hand. "I've heard a lot about you." The thoughts swam around inside Elliot's mind, tangled in a web of confusion and growing outrage. Who was this guy? Why would Jill even think about inviting him and not say anything? Forcing himself to composedness, Elliot fixed a polite smile on his face and extended a hand for Glenn's. "Nice to meet you, Glenn." The voice came out steady, but inside, the unease only grew. "Jill said how hard you work," Glenn said with a smarmy smile, the handshake just a little too firm. "I like a man who puts the hours in." "Yeah, well, someone has to keep the lights on," Elliot said, quickly pulling his hand away and shoving it into his pocket. He caught a glimpse of Jill, who stood far too close to Glenn for his liking. The way she laughed at some whispered comment from Glenn, it all felt wrong. Clearing his throat, Elliot tried to get the conversation back on track. "So, how do you two know one another?" His voice was even, though he could not much longer deny the weirdness building up around him. Jill threw that glancing, almost defiant glance at him. "Oh, Glenn and I go way back." The motion of her hand over the question was dismissive as she collapsed onto the couch. "We ran into each other not too long ago, and I thought it would be fun to catch up." Elliot stood in stunned silence, his head trying to wrap around all this. Jill had never mentioned Glenn's name before, and the way they acted to and with each other wasn't just friendliness, it felt personal. Glenn leaned back onto the couch beside Jill, his arm stretching across the back just inches away from her shoulders. "Yeah, Jill and I were reminiscing about old times. She's been telling me all about the good times you two have had." He winked as Jill giggled. Elliot's stomach twisted. His home no longer felt like his own, as an outsider watched his wife flirt openly with a man who seemed to respect no boundary. Before Elliot could utter a word, there was a cold laugh from the table as Daphne laughed. "Jill, dear," she drawled, ice dripping from her tone, "isn't it about time you told him the truth?" As Elliot turned to face her, his spine ran cold and his pulse quickened. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice even but laced with tension. Jill looked over to her mother and turned back to Elliot, an evil smile creeping into her face. "Mom's right, Elliot," she said so softly, her words were like a whip. She leaned her hand on Glenn's chest, her eyes shining with malice. "It's time you knew the truth. You're a loser." Elliot's heart fell as he stepped closer to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Jill's smile grew, her eyes filled with cold malice. "Oh, come on, Elliot. Don't act all surprised. Did you honestly believe I was content with you all these years?" She took a step away from Glenn, crossing her arms as she looked Elliot up and down, with her head tilted in disdain. "You toil away, exhausting yourself, never sparing any detail, thinking you did me some great favor. But I don't need you. I never did. You were just convenient." She laughed cynically, no more than a glance thrown at her mother, who nodded in approval. "I have been seeing Glenn for months. He is all that you are not. Strong, confident, a real man." Elliot felt his world crumbling. "Months?" he repeated, his voice faltering while his mind struggled to make sense of it. His chest clutched with a mixture of shock, anger, and heartbreak. "Come on, Elliot," Jill sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Don't act so surprised. You've been so busy with your spreadsheets and your work that you never even noticed what was right in front of you." Elliot's hands trembled while he stared at her, his heart racing. "You don't mean this?" he whispered, though down deep he knew she did. "Oh, I mean every word," Jill replied coldly, turning to Glenn, her lips curled into a cruel smile. "And Mom's been telling me to leave you for ages. But why not enjoy the best of both worlds? Glenn gives me everything you can't, especially in bed." She giggled, and Glenn shot Elliot a smug grin. Elliot stood there, unable to move, his whole world shattering around him. Elliot felt a cold dread wash over him as Jill's words took hold, stared at her, then at Glenn, his mind reeling with a storm of disbelief and fury. "Go ahead, tell him," Jill said, playfully nudging Glenn with a grin. Glenn snickered, his eyes locking with Elliot's in an audacious challenge. "Yeah, Elliot, hate to break it to you, but I've been satisfying your wife in ways you never could." Instinctively, Elliot's fists clenched, the nails on his palms cutting deep, as Glenn's smirk grew. "Every time you were busting your ass out there, I was right here, taking care of business." Glenn winked, leaning back in his chair like he'd won some cruel, twisted contest. The room blurred in a haze of rage. Every instinct screamed for him to lunge forward, to strike Glenn, to demand an answer from Jill. Yet, even against his burning anger, Elliot found himself rooted in place, fists shaking, heart racing wildly inside his chest. Violence wasn't the solution. Not here. Not now. Daphne's voice sliced through the thick tension like a sharpened blade. "You've always been such a fool, Elliot," she said, the curve of her lips elevating into a satisfied smirk as she sipped her wine. "I warned Jill not to settle for someone like you. You have always been weak, so small-minded." Her approving glance slid to Glenn. "Now this is the kind of man Jill deserves." Elliot's jaw clenched so hard, he thought his teeth might shatter. Turning to Jill, his eyes in fierce solidity of hurt and betrayal, he asked, "You really believe this?" His voice was reflected in incredulous pain. Jill didn't flinch. She returned his gaze with cold detachment. "I do," she replied, her words laced with a finality. "You mean nothing to me now, Elliot. You were just a stepping stone. Glenn is my future." Glenn snorted, taking a casual sip from his wine. "Yeah, Elliot, face it, buddy. I'm the one in control now." He leaned forward, oozing condescension. "You should have seen the signs. Your wife's been craving a real man, and now she's got one." With the weight of the betrayal bearing down upon him, something inside Elliot shifted. A strange, dangerous calm overtook the fury. His expression turned cold, his mind sharpened by a clarity of the moment. He glanced from Glenn to Jill, revealing nothing on his face, but a silent resolve formed within him. Elliot took his time walking to the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room, cold and unflinching. A moment of silence passed as he stood there, calm, unreadable. "Well," Elliot said in that low, venomous tone of voice, "welcome to the family, dumbass. I hope you enjoy your last meal together." Little did Glenn get the chance to perceive what was happening. In a flash, before anyone could utter a word or even budge an eyebrow, Elliot followed through with breakneck speed. He seized Glenn by the back of his neck, his fingers clenching into the man's skin with the rigid strength of a gauntlet, and without the slightest trepidation, he mashed his face back into the searing bowl of tomato soup that sat before him. The thick red liquid splashed violently across the table, soaking everything in its path. The muffled screams of Glenn were everywhere in the room as his arms flailed in a wide, wild circle in attempts to push Elliot off of him. However, Elliot simply was relentless. His rage gave him strength to keep Glenn in one place. The chaotic sounds filled the entire room, save for Elliot, who spoke and acted with an eerie calmness as he exacted his vengeance. Glenn shrieked in the highest pitch of agony, thrashing about as the scalding boiling soup besmeared his face. Jill gasped in shock while Daphne's wineglass slipped from her fingers, crashing to the hardwood floor as she leapt up from the table. "What the? Elliot!" Jill screamed, the terror mingling with outrage. She flung herself at him, but Elliot was quick, calculated. He released Glenn, who fell back, coughing and choking, his face some crimson blotchy mess of burns. Not a beat later, Elliot whirled on her, his eyes full of fury. "You think you can laugh at me? Call me a loser in my own house?" he snarled, stepping forward. Jill tried to retreat, but Elliot was a fraction of a second quicker. He reached out and grabbed her wrist before she could move, pulling her close. In one swift motion, he twisted her arm and plunged her face into the very bowl of soup. Her screams were muffled by the thick liquid as she struggled wildly, hands clawing at the table in desperation. But Elliot was firm and strong, his strength greater than hers. "You bastard!" Jill screamed as Elliot finally let her go. She stumbled backward, dripping with soup, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. She watched her daughter's humiliation go down and was angry and disgusted, but her face showed more offense, not fear. "You've lost your mind!" Daphne screeched, stepping toward Elliot. "How dare you? You're pathetic, always have been. Elliot hunched over, his chest heaving with the adrenaline coursing in his veins, but turned slowly to Daphne. A chilling smile formed on his lips. Decades of pent-up anger began to eke out now, piece by piece, like fissures forming in a dam. Me? Lost my mind? He asked, his tone unthreateningly calm. You're the one who's been poisoning her against me from the very start, Daphne. He took a step closer, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her face. You've been feeding her lies, waiting for me to fail, whispering in her ear, pushing her to leave me. His voice louder now, Jill winced with his words. Well, guess what? I'm done with all of you. Daphne would have protested, but the sharp wave of Elliot's hand cut her off. Enough, he said, and the serious tone in his voice brooked absolutely no argument. You think you can humiliate me, use me, and then just walk away scot-free? You think I'm just going to let it slide? Think again. Jill wiped the soup from her face, still struggling to compose herself, defiance still boiling in her veins. You're insane, Elliot, she spat, her tone shaking with anger. You really think hurting us makes you some kind of hero? Look at yourself. You're a joke. For a long while, Elliot said nothing at all, simply stared at her, his eyes cold, almost calculating. For the first time that evening, Jill seemed to realize the extent of his anger. Glenn slumped in his chair and whimpered as he touched at his blistered face gingerly, but Elliot and Jill had no attention for him. You still don't get it, do you? Elliot finally said, his voice low, almost calm. I'm not trying to be a hero. I don't care what you think of me anymore. You made your choice. You threw away our marriage for this. He gestured toward Glenn, who groaned pitifully in his seat. Anger flitted across Jill's face, but she didn't back down. You were never enough, Elliot, she spat. You'll never be enough. Not for me, not for anyone. I would have left you anyway. Glenn is a real man, not some sad, overworked loser like you. Daphne nodded, curling her lip in a sneer. She's right, Elliot. You were always beneath her. You could never provide for her the way a real man could. You can't give her what she deserves. Elliot's gaze cut to Daphne. Darker, more dangerous. His expression twisted into a cold smile as he took an overt step toward her. And you, he whispered, his voice low and threatening. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Telling her she deserves better, convincing her I'm a failure. He stopped mere inches from her, locking his eyes into hers. Well, Daphne, here's your reality check. The only losers here are you and your daughter. Daphne recoiled, her face a little pale, her confidence shaken. How dare you speak with me like that? She hissed. You're nothing. Before she could get further, Elliot brought his hand down on the table with a loud crack that silenced everyone in the room. You've taken enough from me, he said icily. Now it's my turn to take something back. You want to be with him? Fine. But you're not getting a single cent from me, not after what you've done. The room fell silent. Jill's face turned ashen, with the weight of Elliot's words just dawning on her. There was a flash of panic in her eyes. You can't do this, she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. You can't just leave me with nothing. Elliot's cold smile never wavered. Watch me. Weakened and shaking, groaned Glenn from his seat. You can't just end. Shut up, Glenn. Elliot cut him off sharply with no glance his way. You're both done. You made your choices. Now live with the consequences. Daphne stood frozen, her face covered in shock, as Elliot turned his back upon them and headed toward the door. Where are you going? Jill's panicked voice shook as she called out to him. Elliot stopped, his hand on the door handle, his back still to them. Away from all of you, he said, not his voice raised, nor even breaking, but steady, calm. You've taken enough of my life. I'm taking it back. And with those words, he was gone, leaving what was left of a family that once was. Over the next several days, Elliot's life began to right itself. But for him, it wasn't chaos. It was a period of clarity. First, he was in this marriage consumed by lies and manipulation for years, and finally, he was in control. Every move he made from now on was with deliberation. Not out of anger, but as a quiet, calculated resolve. His revenge wasn't going to be one astonishing act. It was going to be slow and methodical. It was all about the paperwork. I want this divorce wrapped up, and I want it done as soon as possible, Elliot said to his attorney over the telephone. I am not looking at some prolonged battle. I just want it done, and I want her to walk away with nothing. We shall get through it all with great speed, Elliot, the lawyer assured him. With all that you have provided us with, evidence, documents, and so on, it should be a clean case. Elliot had kept every message, all the financial documents of each and every little evidence of Jill's affair. Her trying to siphon off all their money from joint accounts. Her being adulterous. It was all put together with due care. His lawyers presented it without any further delay, and in days to come, the divorce papers were served to Jill. But Elliot did not stop there. He saw to it that news of Jill's perfidy spread like wildfire through their social milieus. He had only to nod his head, and the tale of that fateful dinner, of Jill's affair with Glenn, somehow managed to find its way along the grapevine without his having to lift a finger. It wasn't long before all their friends, relatives, and acquaintances knew the details, how Jill had flaunted her affair, bragged about using Elliot for his money, and treated him like a stepping stone. Her phone had buzzed non-stop in the days following the dinner, but the messages weren't what she had come to expect. Instead of sympathetic and supportive, they'd been shock-filled, disgusted, and judgmental. Friends who once adored her began to withdraw themselves from her life. One of her closest friends, "I thought you were better than that, Jill." Another, "Can't believe you would do that to Elliot of all people. I think we need some space." Her once closely knit circle of friends began to tear apart, leaving her in isolation. All the lies that had served as foundations in her life were crumbling, and for the first time in years, Elliot felt the weight of the past lift off his shoulders. Jill's attempts at self-defense were in vain. The nicely tailored image she had built over these years, the perfect wife, the charming socialite, was crumbling down more quickly than she could manage. Her pleas for sympathy went unheard, her facade broken. "How could they all turn on me like this?" she fumed, pacing through the now empty house. The once bustling home felt eerily quiet, a blunt reminder that Glenn too had abandoned her after that dinner. He had disappeared and stopped responding to her calls, unread her messages. "You can't just leave me. Answer your damn phone," Jill wailed, flinging her phone onto the couch after another rejected call. Glenn was gone, and she was utterly alone in what once had been her kingdom. But it wasn't her house anymore, not for long. Elliot had anticipated every move she might make. The instant the divorce papers were served, he cut off her access to their joint accounts, stopped paying her credit cards, and left all the bills in her name. The reality of her financial situation hit like a ton of bricks, and in days, Jill was facing the grim reality. "Elliot can't do this," she muttered to herself as she stared at the empty accounts. "There's got to be a way around this." But there wasn't. Elliot had made sure of it. Every dollar she thought was hers had been secured, leaving her scrambling in disbelief. Daphne did no better. Years before, Elliot had quietly supported her profligate lifestyle by paying her rent and covering her expenses simply to maintain peace with Jill. Now that obligation was gone too. He cut her off cold, taking quiet satisfaction in watching Daphne face the mess she had helped create. At her wit's end, Daphne called Elliot one afternoon, the sweetness in her tone almost to the point of being sickly. "Elliot, darling, this has all been one big misunderstanding," she cooed, trying to smooth things over. "You know Jill wasn't serious. Let's be adults about it and sort it out." Chuckle barely repressed, Elliot sat comfortably in his modest new apartment. He let her ramble on for a few minutes before cutting in. "Daphne, we're done," he said firmly. "You've been nothing but poison for years. I won't give you another dime. Find someone else to leech off." Then Daphne's voice went cold in an instant, dripping with venom. "You will regret this, Elliot. You think you can survive without us? You are nothing without Jill." "I am doing better already," said Elliot coolly, and hung up before she could finish her rant. Meanwhile, Glenn was doing no better. Since that humiliating dinner, he became a laughingstock. Nothing was required from Elliot. The word spread. And in no time, everybody was talking about Glenn locally. People made fun of him, calling him the arrogant sweetheart who got his face dipped in a bowl of soup. Too much shame to bear, he stopped going to his favorite places until, one day, he disappeared over the horizon. Rumor had it that he had moved away. Talk and scorn being what he couldn't escape wherever he went. With Glenn gone, matters for Jill only worsened. The bills kept piling up, and soon enough she could no longer afford the house. Her credit cards were maxed out. And since Elliot was by now paying none of the real expenses, the proceeds from the sale of the house barely covered her multiplying debts. In a span of weeks, the life she had worked so hard to build crumbled around her, piece by piece. Elliot watched it all from a distance. He had never once lent a hand. The emails Jill had sent, the tearful voicemails begging for help, meant nothing to him now. She made her choices, and now it was time to face the music. In desperation, Jill threw herself at the mercy of her few remaining friends. She hoped that maybe somebody would take her in and help rebuild the life she had lost. But most of them had already distanced themselves, not wanting to be seen with this woman who had betrayed her husband so cruelly. "I'm sorry, Jill," one said over the phone, no impoliteness in her voice, but firm. "I just don't think I can help you right now. I hope you figure things out." "Please, I have nowhere else to go," Jill cried, but the call was already gone. The lifelines that were there disappeared one by one until she was utterly alone. Meanwhile, Elliot prospered. He had moved into a small but very warm apartment in town, where people around him were concerned about him, not because of the vaporous life that he had previously led, but because of who he was. At last, he found the peace he had looked for, the kind of calmness he didn't know had been missing all those years. Elliot soon found himself regularly hitting the gym, picking up new hobbies, and even dating again. The new life wasn't extravagant. It was just simple and real. Truly, for the first time in years, Elliot felt unencumbered free of all those lies, manipulation, and betrayal that had haunted him for so long. He sat on his balcony that evening with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset, when suddenly his phone buzzed. It was an email from Jill, long, filled with apologies and excuses, and desperate pleas for a second chance. "I made a mistake, Elliot. I didn't know what I had until it was gone. Please, can we talk?" The screen stared back at Elliot for a moment. The old anger flickered faintly, then it was gone. He smiled wryly to himself. He was over it, and whatever Jill had said meant nothing. He closed the email without a second thought and stepped back onto the balcony, stepping right onto the new life he built for himself, and leaving the ruins of the past behind him. Jill, Glenn, and Daphne had to face the mess they had created, all scrabbling around, picking up the pieces. A knock at the door cut the stillness. Elliot turned to the clock. It was late, past the time for casual callers. A brow furrowed, he went to the door and peered through the peephole. With surprise, he found Frank standing on the doorstep, an old friend he hadn't seen in months. Elliot rapidly unlocked the door and opened it, smiling. "Frank, it's been ages." Frank nodded, exhausted but warm. "Yeah, it has. Sorry to just drop by like this, but I needed to talk." "No worries. Come on in," said Elliot as he stepped aside. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Yeah, sure. Whatever you're having." Frank came in, his eyes doing a fast sweep of Elliot's new apartment. "Nice place. Looks like you're doing well." "Thanks," Elliot said, refilling Frank's glass with wine. "It's been a long journey, but I'm in a good place now." Sipping his wine, Frank nodded reflectively. "I've heard some things about Jill." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What now?" Frank vacillated and continued. "She's been telling people that she wants to reconcile with you. She has been talking to mutual friends, saying that she regrets everything and wants to make it right." Elliot laughed, sudden and jolting. Frank glared at him, the look making Elliot shake his head, breaking into a grin. "You're serious?" She had years to fix things, and instead, she threw it all away for someone like Glenn. "I'm done with her, Frank. She can say whatever she wants, but that part of my life is over." Frank leaned back and took in the tenor of Elliot's words. "I figured as much, just thought you should know." "Thanks," Elliot replied, taking another sip of his wine. "But there's nothing she can say or do to change things now. I've moved on. It's time she did too." They sat quietly for a few moments, the weight of the conversation lingering between them. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "You seem different," he observed, his tone thoughtful. "In a good way. Like you've really turned a corner." Elliot smiled and nodded in agreement. "I have, and it wasn't easy. However, walking away from all that toxicity was the best thing I ever did. I have built my life back together, and I'm a lot better off without all that drama." "Good for you, man," Frank said as he raised his glass to toast him. "To new beginnings."